So we are at the end of this series of 4 lectures on the issue of suffering and evil and the problem of suffering. I tried to entice you to come by promising that I would give the solution to the problem. I'm afraid probably is not going to happen. But I tried in this final lecture to give a little bit where I am, having thought about the issue for a while, and I'm planning, as I am at the moment, to write on it probably during the summer. These lectures have really been helped me to at least rehearse the arguments and have forced me a little bit to come to some, at least to some points, let's say, some landmarks, some marks on the sand. I say that with this lecture, we come to the end of this series, but in reality, we are going to carry on talking about the same issue from a different viewpoint with a series on healing. We're going to start from next Sunday with Gillian Strain, who is a former colleague of mine at St. Paul's Knightsbridge in London, who is the head also of a Guild of Health in the UK, and who is doing an extraordinary amount of work on healing and well-being. And I recorded with her a podcast last week, or 2 weeks ago, sorry, which has been now is available. So I will send you during this week a link to this podcast. So she interviewed me on prayer for healing. And I think this is going to be a very good introduction to the series on healing. I'm going to start next, we are going to start next weekend during the whole period of Lent. And then there's going to be this book group on, or conversations, as I said, on forgiveness, on the issue of forgiveness. This is going to be every Thursday evening between 6:30 and 8 during Lent online. So everyone who is interested in this can get in touch with me, and I will send information about this also during the week. So let's dive into the topic of today. Is there any value in suffering? So first I want to step back a little bit and try to recapture the whole what we have seen in the past few weeks. You remember that the main argument of theodicies, so the justifications of God, attempts to justify God when confronted with the problem of evil, is that it is faith in God that puts us in the position of having to hold together 3 apparently incompatible beliefs. The first one is creation. God created the world out of nothing, in the sense that what it means that we cannot believe that there was pre-existent matter or another divinity, evil divinity. So we cannot attribute evil to anything that was at the same time as God or before God. So everything that exists comes from God, directly or indirectly. So this is why we cannot get God off the hook, in a sense, for the problem of evil, because we are asked to believe that everything comes from Him. And then there is the fact that God is all-powerful. So if He is all-powerful, why He doesn't do anything for evil? And then God is love, the God revealed by Jesus Christ. So if God is loving, why does He make us suffer? And you remember Hume's sentence, if God, in number 2, give it again in number 2, the philosopher David Hume, if God is willing to prevent evil, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then He is impotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He is malevolent. And if He's both able and willing, where does evil come from? Now, The main problem, I hope it has become clear in the discussion we had in the past 3 weeks with this argument, is that it is based on an abstract understanding of what creation is, what power is, and what love is. As I told you last time, it will be what we would do if we were the creators of the world, how we would create the world, or how, if we were kind of all-powerful, how we would use this power. Or it is our understanding of love. Understanding of love is, whatever anyone has, but tends to be, can be cocooning someone, can be preventing someone from ever experiencing trials in his or her life, etc., etc. Okay? So, in particular, we tend to understand creation almost as an act of wizardry. So God, has his magic wand, and without any really involvement. A wizard can whip up something, conjure up something out of nothing, let's say, without him implicating himself in any way. So often we have, unwittingly, this notion of creation in our mind. And then we understand, especially, I think, power in isolation from love, okay? Not as a loving power. What a loving power of the kind of love that God has would look like, okay? And then, more importantly, and this is the problem of basically all theodicies, they try to create arguments against evil or for the problem of evil that speak to everyone, whether they believe or they not believe in God. And this is a flawed approach because believing in God is not just a rational thing. Is not solved just by coming up with arguments that persuade us that God exists and God wants our good, etc., etc. The way in which we come to believe in God is much more complex than that. And when it comes to Christianity, we know God not because we have come up with an idea of God on the basis of our experience, even if this has a role in our understanding of God, but it is very marginal and it is very, very fraught. In reality, if we are Christians, it is because we believe that the only way we can have any knowledge, anything that counts as real knowledge of God is through Jesus Christ, okay? I put here the sentence from John 1:18, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with him, with the Father, has made him known. So, unless Jesus makes God known, we do not know God. The only way we can come to an understanding of who God is by looking at what Jesus has done, what he has said, what his life has manifested. Okay? Now, interestingly, Paul, number 5 in your handout, Paul talks about new creation. He says that, what Jesus has done, in his life and his death on the cross and his resurrection is recreating the world. Okay? Now, obviously the world is the same as, there's a continuity. We have not seen something appear out of nothing again. So what does it mean? And I think is by looking a little bit of how Jesus has realized this new creation that we can understand what the first, the original creation was. How did Jesus recreated the world? How did he, the world was going, wrong. This is why he came, God came, became incarnate. And Jesus did a number of things, okay? So what did he do? Now, I give you a little example. If you, let's say, compare the act of creation to an artisan who makes a bowl out of metal, I choose metal because it's easier in this comparison, and you drop it and it really kind of is deformed in such a way that it's you cannot salvage anymore. What do? You melt the metal all over again, and you make another ball. Okay, so this would be an idea. We could think about recreation in this way. It's an act of total mastery. I can do with this gold whatever I want. So I can melt it, and I can even make another thing. Not a bowl, but I can make I can make a piece of jewelry. I can make a sword. I can make anything out of it. Whereas when we see what Jesus did was not to destroy everything. Let's think about the flood, okay, as an act of recreation. It could be a new creation. So God was so fed up with humanity, they decided to wipe out the whole world, whole of humanity, and start all over again. Jesus could have done exactly the same thing. Come, say, oh, you are all sinners, I'm going to wipe you out, kill everyone, and then I'm going to create two new beings, and we start all over again. Okay? Whereas, what we see that Jesus did was, I put some principles, but there are many more in number 7, the refusal of any form of coercion. There was a problem, with the way we behave and behaved, but Jesus did not come and force us to do anything. The refusal to fight violence with violence, evil with display of power. When Peter, tried to defend Jesus using a sword, he said, Jesus stopped him. Okay, and then instead, what did he do? He used persuasion, he showed compassion, and especially he embraced our condition, our limitations, including our vulnerability to suffering and death. Now you can think this as God relinquishing his prerogatives and embracing something which is not God, or doing something which is God, in a sense, not doing something that it's not godly. But, and I quoted you again here, Philippians 2:5-11, Jesus, though, and I said to you that this though means because, Christ Jesus, because he was God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. So the act of emptying himself, the act of humbling himself, the act of the choice of not using coercion, not using violence, not using, but choosing persuasion instead, is not a derogation to what God is, but it is what God is. It's the way God behaves. Is the only way he can do things. Is the only way he can do things, because this is what to be God is. To be God is, and this is why we need really, this is why Christianity, faith is a conversion, is basically we have to turn like 180 degrees on the other direction. It's because we have to change entirely our understanding of what being God is. As long as we have an anthropomorphic, kind of a human or version or understanding of God, as long as we understand God as a magnified version of ourselves, then we will never make sense of what happened in Jesus Christ. We will never be able to explain why the way in which he decided to save the world was by taking it on himself, by humbling himself, by emptying himself. This is why it is only when we have access through faith to this understanding of who God is that then we see in a completely different way even the problem of evil and suffering. So what are the consequences of what I've just said? Well, 9.1, creation is not comparable to the work of an artisan who makes a metal bowl and who exercises total control over that which he calls into being. But as we saw last time, and I think last time really we touched something that at least to me speaks most about, helps me most to see, to come to some sort of understanding of why especially natural evil, even in creating the world, God in a way emptied himself, humbled himself, made room for other than himself to come into existence. So in this sense, creation is not an act of wizardry, but is God And I gave you this example. God occupied the whole of this room, and creating for God meant, well, I'll have to give up a little bit of this room for something else. Okay? So made room for. It's an image. Of course, it's an image, but it's really, it gives us a sense of the fact that the act of creation is something that really implied that God accepted that something other than himself would come into existence, and that this something would not be God, okay, and that there would be an element of unpredictability and risk in this, which is very difficult to accept if we keep our understanding of God as all-powerful, always, and totally in control of everything. No, God relinquished control in order to create us. And relinquished, God is not OCD, okay? When he takes us very seriously, and not us, but also the world. So when he gives existence, it really gives existence. When he gives freedom, it really gives freedom. When he makes a gift, he really does it, okay? And another element of God's character that appears throughout Scripture is that God is faithful. When God makes a gift, he never takes it back, even if it goes sour. Okay? So a comparison with parenthood, I think, can help us. Having a child can initially be perceived by the parents as giving birth to a continuation of themselves. Okay, I will have my little thing, it's going to be mine. You know the vocabulary we use. Now, this doesn't work even for dogs. Okay, I promise you. I mean, they are their own thing, and they can make your life much more interesting, let's say. So, with children, initially we might have this idea about having a child, but very, very soon we have to be, there's a reality check. The moment you have made room for a new life, a new person, your power, let's in inverted commas, to determine her or his future is very limited. Care, education, love can have a lot of influence in shaping the future of this new person, but what she or he will become is an element of unpredictability and risk. Now, obviously, creating the world is not the same thing as having a child, but there is a real kind of similarity there. And where is the similarity? Is that it's an act of love. Okay? Accepting this unpredictability and risk is not an expression of lacking power, of lacking love, or lacking faithfulness. Power to have a child means ability to make room for the child, accepting the unknown, and that the only meaningful influence you will ever have on this child depends on your unconditional love. That is anything but total control. Try to control a child and see what happens. Okay? Now you see, it's evident. Total control is not what being a parent is. It might have been a fantasy of some, especially of some cultures. It would prevent the child from becoming a functioning and thriving human being. It would be an obstacle to a loving relationship. In a word, total control is the opposite of love. The more love is powerful, the less it is controlling, the more it is limited. This is why we cannot. The problem with the argument of evil is that we separate power from love in our understanding of God. The more love is powerful, the less it is controlling. The more it has to leave room for the unpredictability and the risk. Okay? It is an expression of power, but not raw power, but of the power of love. So in this light, we see how deeply flawed Hume's argument is. So he says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, God is absolutely willing to prevent evil. He doesn't want evil. He wants our good. Why does he create the world? Why does he create us? Why does he, in whichever way he did it? Certainly not to inflict suffering on someone, not to have something that goes wrong. So God is absolutely willing to prevent evil. And the reason why he's not always able, because he's able to prevent evil most of the time. I know that, we have been seeing the glass half empty for the past month. But, there is also a lot of beauty and a lot of, the universe, thank God. There is the sun, there is friendship. We are here today. We're still alive. That have to count as some good, right? But the reason why he's not always able to prevent evil is not because he's impotent, but because of the power of his love. Because his love is too powerful. And this loving power puts limitations on what God can do and implies that for our sake, God has to accept the possibility of evil. Okay? So, having said that, when we apply this to, you remember we distinguished moral evils and natural evils. Moral evils are the evil we cause. Okay? And, a lot of the evil we have in our lives and the suffering comes from what we inflict on each other and what we have, the way we have so warped, so compromised relationships, institutions, way we do transactions, etc., that, this evil has accumulated and has become something that is sometimes beyond everyone's control. Okay? Now, I think it is very easy to see the validity of what I've just said up to now when applied to moral evils, because we understand that in order to love we need freedom, and that the evil and suffering is the result of human freedom. It is a bit more complicated or more challenging with regards to natural evils, or rather natural bad things, earthquakes, illness, death. Why a powerful love has to allow the universe to function the way it does, and we mentioned the principle of entropy. Why could not God tweak the system here and there in such a way that, to correct the possible, bad influence or the possible bad impact of the way creation function on ourselves. So inanimate things have no freedom, so how can they go wrong? What prevents God from exercising total power on inanimate things? We think rightly that I cannot have total control on a child, but I hope I have total control over the things I use. I decide this has to stay here, stays here. If I want to put it there, I'm going to put it there. And I'm not feeling wrong by having what looks like total control on this lectern, for instance. Okay? Here too, though, we have to come to the conclusion that God does not exercise power in this way because this is not the kind of power he has. This is not the kind of God he is. And here it becomes a little bit, we can also be a little bit disappointed. We can find God pathetic, and I suppose a lot of people do, come on, really? And there is an argument for that. Even with inanimate things, he lets them be. Lets them deploy their own internal potential in ways that include unpredictability and risk. This is the only view compatible with science, what science tells us of the universe. What science tells us of the universe is there was, the beginning, there was just this whatever there was at the beginning, and then it exploded, the Big Bang, whatever the Big Bang was, and then out of that, and out of the way in which, these particles interacted with themselves, here we are, okay, over billions and billions of years. So that, if we have to imagine an act of creation, is really giving to this, whatever initial element was there, the potential to develop into what we have now, but then letting it be, not being there tweaking it all the time. The low regularity principle we mentioned during our first lesson. What we know is that this is the reality we have, and that's it. Let us remember that as long as no human beings are part of the picture, there is no evil and not even bad things. I mean, the fact that the way in which the temperature of the sun is millions and millions of degrees, or that it's not a problem for us because we are not on the sun, and we'll never. I mean, I hope we'll never be there. The collision of planets, the explosion of stars, black holes, even the principle of entropy. That determines that all the things really have to die at one point. All these phenomena that are potentially dangerous for human beings are the processes that explain the creativity of the universe as we know it, and ended up producing the planet in which our life has become possible. These same processes can indeed be harmful to us when they happen on Earth. Let's think about earthquakes. An earthquake on Mars, I mean, is not even a bad thing. Is part of the life of that planet, right? And this is the part of unpredictability and risk that can cause bad things to happen to us. Now, this approach does not give us a rational explanation of evil and suffering and an answer to the argument against the existence of God. It is, as many thinkers say, is more a defense based on faith. Okay? It can really speak only to those who have faith in Jesus and believe that what we see in Jesus is a revelation of who God is. Now, briefly, I want to turn to a more pastoral or spiritual approach to these questions. And especially when the issue of suffering. So is there any value in suffering? And we have been following for the past 3 really lectures and part of the lecture today, the line of why evil and suffering. Now, it is true that, at least in my experience, whenever people, and this happens to me, I wouldn't say daily, but pretty much, as soon as someone knows I'm a priest, I tell to someone, a random stranger I meet at the club, and I tell him, I am. Oh, I shouldn't have said club online. And I say, I'm a priest. The first question is, they start immediately to talk about something that has been a cause of suffering for them, and they say why. But it is never really a question as to why. Because if I try to say, to say all the things I've said to now, I mean, I basically after the first sentence, the person doesn't listen anymore. Not because they would not potentially be interested in that. It's just because it's not the answer they want. First of all, when they ask why, it's only because they want to have someone who listens to their suffering. Okay, and really, most of the time, the real questions people have is not why, but why me. Okay, and especially what now? What am I going to do? Okay, with this experience in my life, I don't know what to do with this. And it is with regards to these 2 questions that indeed faith, I think, proves to be incredibly comforting and powerful. To the why me question, well, I think it has become clear by now that only lack of faith in God, or a very flawed form of belief in God, can indulge in the idea that God uses suffering either for our soul formation. You remember Hick, in our second lecture, was a form of punishment. Despite what a lot of the imagery of Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, might lead us to believe, God never uses suffering as a form of punishment or as a form of reward. This is a projection, a human projection on God, that God has spent thousands of years to help us to move forward from this anthropomorphic understanding of how God acts to what has been revealed in Jesus Christ. Okay, so this idea, and this could be the subject of an entire series of lectures in itself, God never uses suffering as punishment or as reward. I'm going to quote again from this book I quoted from several times by Kushner, why bad things happen to good people, who says this: clergymen know that any time there is a death, the survivors will feel guilty. There seems to be two elements involved in our readiness to feel guilty. The first is our strenuous need to believe that the world makes sense, that there is a cause for every fact and reason for everything that happens. This leads us to find patterns and connections, both where they really exist. Smoking leads to lung cancer, people who wash their hands have fewer contagious diseases, and where they exist only in our mind. God sent me this illness to teach me a lesson. Okay? The second element of why we feel guilty is the notion that we are the cause of what happens, especially the bad things that happen to us. Even Job would rather have God document his guilt than admit that it was all a mistake. If he could be shown that he deserved his faith, then at least the world would make sense. See, very often we prefer to believe that, we must have done something. We must be, this must be a punishment. This must be a reward. This must be a teaching lesson. Because it is easier to accept this than the idea that this has happened randomly, or that this is something that, it's maddening to think that, especially, something that, like a death of a dear one, etc., is something that just happened. Just happened. Because it happens. Because this is the world we live in. Okay? So I agree with Kushner, with almost everything Kushner says here, except the idea that we live in a random world. Okay, there is an element of randomness in the way bad things happen to us, but nothing random about the principle of entropy, the fact that we all have to die, that our biology entails vulnerability to viruses, etc. This is part of the way the universe functions. Okay. This is how reality works. It might not be, as Leibniz said, the best of possible worlds, as we saw in our first lecture, but we have to believe that it is the best God could muster, considering the limitations entailed by the nature of his loving power. And now here, this is difficult. Basically, the idea that, God says to us, this is the best I could do. This is the best I could do. But the best I could do not because I am powerless, but because of the nature of my loving power. Now, I don't know if this is convincing or is not convincing. It's not a proof. It's not a kind of waterproof argument against the existence of, or to explain the existence of evil. It doesn't explain anything. But I think, at least to me, is the thing that comes closer to give me a sense of, to give me some sense of why things go the way they do. Okay, and then, briefly, because I want to leave some more time for conversation, I want to go to what now. So the second question people usually have when it comes to suffering is what now? Suffering is not, there's a kind of a typo here, suffering is not intended by God, neither directly or indirectly. We have established that. But this does not mean that suffering does not have any value. Okay? Even people who do not believe in God and have no faith testify that when suffering happens, it can, not always it does, or it can sometimes at the end of a certain process, but it can make us more resilient, more mature, more compassionate. Okay? So suffering is not sent us to teach us these things, but it is true that taken in the right way, when it happens, it can kind of improve us as human beings. We can develop all these qualities without suffering, of course, and it would be preferable. But trials are unavoidable in life, and learning how to live with them is an essential aspect of our emotional and spiritual growth. Okay? So, in the end, I'm going to skip to the end, then you can read by yourself the other things. I want to say this, that most of the occasions for suffering in our lives could be prevented in a very simple way. There is a secret. Now, this I'm going to give you, the secret of reducing suffering in your lives almost to nothing, or to very, very little. That is a very, very, very simple secret. By choosing not to love anyone. If you don't love anyone, you'll eliminate automatically probably 90% of the occasions of sufferings in your life. There's still going to be illness and people annoying you outside, and possibly death. But you will avoid so much more. If you have no friends, you're not going to have disappointments and arguments. If you have no children, oh my God, you're going to spare yourself so much. If you don't marry, oh my God, your life is going to be perfect. So, if you never love, you never become vulnerable to the unavoidable risks entailed by relationship with other people. If you never give birth to a child, you spare another human being the risks of bad things happening to him or her and to death. And often, our argument with God could be, well, if you knew that it was going to happen, why did you create us? Or that there were risks. But a child could say the same thing to his parents. If you knew that you were kind of bringing me into a world where I would have to undergo so much suffering and difficulties, why did you even make me exist? But some people might say that at some particular moments of their lives, but obviously this is not something. Existence is a good that we value about everything else. If God never created the world, he would have spared us from evil and suffering. And more importantly, if God never created the world, he would have spared himself from having to die on the cross. Because let's not forget this thing, is that when God created the world, he didn't accept risk and unpredictability for us only, but for himself. Because again, it was not an act of wizardry. It was something in which he implicated himself to the point that, obviously God knew that from the beginning, this would have meant for him to die on the cross. Okay? In other words, the risks entailed with creating the world, were just not for us, but for God himself. Just as giving birth to a child, the parents accept the risks and suffering that this will entail for themselves, not only for the child. Okay? So you see, in the end, is this powerful love that seems powerless in dealing with suffering and evil to a certain extent, but as a function of the power of this love. So we can still think that God is all-powerful, but is the all-powerfulness of a love that cannot do otherwise than the way God does it. It is not probably very satisfying, especially seen from the viewpoint where we are now. We don't know how we're going to think about this, if what we are promised in the future will happen. We know that God is tackling evil and suffering. That's another important dimension which I cannot develop here. God is not passive. God, this is why, he has implicated himself, and our faith makes us believe that God is conducting a final battle against evil in Jesus Christ and through us Christians with the church in history. Okay? And we even know, or are promised, whether we believe in this promise or not, that evil is going to be once and for all through this confrontation, ultimate confrontation between God and evil. But it's very difficult to see from where we are now, and yet, we have this promise, and it's essential part of our faith. This is a difficult question to live with, but difficult questions are good for us. Difficult questions are good for us, and dealing with these difficult questions is good for us, because even if we never come up, obviously, even personally, I'm not satisfied with this answer, but I feel that having engaged with it, or keeping engaging with this, is something that really keeps me awake, keeps me alert, keeps me open, for more meaning.